Elian Voss woke before sunrise like he did most mornings. The sky outside his cabin window was still dark, painted in soft shades of navy and gray, with only the faintest hint of orange bleeding along the eastern ridge. He lay in bed for a few quiet seconds listening to the familiar sounds of the forest, the distant hoot of an owl winding down its night shift, the rustle of pine needles in the cool breeze, the soft creak of old wood settling. It was peaceful, predictable. Exactly the kind of calm he needed after years spent in louder, more chaotic places. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, feet meeting the worn wooden floor. No alarm clock, no phone buzzing, just his own rhythm tuned to the land he'd sworn to protect. He filled his kettle, lit the stove, and while the water heated, he laced up his boots. They were scuffed and muddy, the soles worn thin in places, but they fit like a second skin. His green Ranger jacket hung by the door, smelling faintly of campfire smoke and pine resin. He slipped it on, grabbed his thermos already filled with strong black coffee, and stepped outside. The air was crisp, carrying that sharp, clean scent that only comes in early autumn. Dew clung to the grass, glistening under the porch light. Elian took a slow sip of coffee, letting the warmth spread through his chest. Another day in Cedar Hollow Reserve, another day of quiet duty. Cedar Hollow wasn't a flashy park. No waterfalls with Instagram crowds, no gift shops or paved trails. It was rugged, remote, and mostly forgotten by tourists. That's what Elian loved about it. Out here, nature ran the show. Deer wandered freely at dawn. Black bears occasionally raided unsecured trash bins. Eagles circled high above the canopy. And sometimes, if you were lucky, you'd spot a bobcat slipping through the underbrush like a shadow. Elian had been the sole ranger for this sector for nearly 5 years now. And in that time, he'd learned every trail, every creek bend, every old-growth tree that stood like a silent guardian. Today's task was routine. Check the motion sensor cameras along the northern ridge, near the old logging road that hadn't seen a truck in decades. Those cameras helped track wildlife movement, especially for research on elk migration. But lately, they'd also picked up the occasional trespasser. Not poachers exactly, but curious hikers who ignored the no entry beyond this point signs, drawn by rumors of hidden caves or abandoned cabins. Elian didn't mind curiosity, but safety came first. The terrain beyond the ridge was steep, unstable in places, and cell service vanished like mist. He shouldered his pack, light today, just water, a first aid kit, extra batteries, and a notebook, and set off down the trail. His boots crunched softly on the gravel path, the only sound besides the wind whispering through the firs. He walked with an easy stride, eyes scanning not just the path ahead but the edges, the snapped twig, the disturbed moss, the faint imprint in the dirt. He wasn't just walking. He was reading. About 2 miles in, the forest opened slightly where a lightning strike had felled a massive cedar years ago. Sunlight poured through the gap, illuminating patches of bright green ferns and wild huckleberry bushes heavy with late-season fruit. Elian paused to check one of the trail cameras strapped to a nearby trunk. He swapped out the memory card, jotting a quick note in his log. Camera number 7, functioning, battery at 60% tour. As he stood, something caught his eye, not on the ground, but high above. In the fork of a towering Douglas fir, maybe 40 feet up, sat a structure that didn't belong. At first, he thought it was a squirrel dray, those messy, leafy nest squirrels build. But this was too big. Way too big. It spanned nearly 6 feet across, woven tightly with branches, moss, and what looked like strips of bark. It had layers, almost like a basket turned inside out, with a rounded dome on top. And it wasn't just piled together, it looked intentional. Designed. Elian frowned. Eagles built large nests, sure, but they preferred open limbs near water, not deep in dense forest like this. And eagle nests didn't have that odd symmetry, that careful layering. He stepped closer, tilting his head. His ranger instincts prickled. Something was off. He circled the base of the tree slowly, eyes scanning upward. The nest sat snug in the Y of 2 thick branches, sheltered from wind and rain. Then he saw it, a flash of unnatural color tucked beneath the outer rim. Blue. Faded. Weathered. But unmistakably synthetic. A tarp? Why would a tarp be woven into a nest? His pulse quickened just a little. He pulled out his phone and zoomed in, snapping several photos from different angles. The light was still soft, golden, perfect for detail. In one shot, he could clearly see the edge of the blue material pinned under a lattice of green branches. Not just draped, integrated. like someone had built this thing by hand. He lowered his phone, heart now thudding steadily in his chest. This wasn't animal work. No animal used plastic tarps. No animal planned like this. He took a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm. Jumping to conclusions wouldn't help. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe some survivalist kid thought it'd be cool to build a tree fort and hide it. But the location was too remote for that. And the craftsmanship, it felt too deliberate, too hidden. He scanned the ground around the tree. Nothing obvious at first, just pine needles, fallen cones, the usual forest litter. But then near a patch of ferns he spotted something. A flattened area, as if someone had sat or slept there. And beside it, a small pile of charred sticks. Recent, maybe just a day or two old. No proper fire ring, just a quick hidden burn. Elian didn't touch anything. He'd been trained never to disturb potential evidence. Instead, he backed up a few steps and began a wider circle, eyes sharp. That's when he saw the first footprint, partially covered by leaves but clear enough in the soft earth near a mossy log. Bootprint, larger than his own, deep heel impression suggesting weight, fresh. He followed the faint trail it led to. Crushed ferns, a snapped sapling, a candy wrapper, chocolate, brand he didn't recognize, stuck to a low branch. Whoever had been here hadn't tried very hard to cover their tracks. Or maybe they didn't think anyone would come this far. His mind raced. Was this person still nearby? Was it dangerous? He reached for his radio, thumb hovering over the talk button. But what would he say? Found a weird nest? They'd laugh. He needed more. He returned to the base of the tree, this time looking higher, squinting into the shadows beneath the nest's overhang. That's when he saw it, the glint of something metallic. A buckle, a can. He couldn't tell. But then just below it, half buried in moss, lay something small and dark. He crouched, careful not to step on anything. It was a child's shoe, tiny, scuffed, covered in dried mud, navy blue with a white sole, worn at the heel, abandoned. Elian's breath caught. All the calm of the morning evaporated. His hands went cold despite the rising sun. A child's shoe out here, in the middle of nowhere. With a handmade nest in the trees and signs of recent human activity, this wasn't a prank. This wasn't a lost hiker. He stood slowly, scanning the trees around him as if expecting someone to step out from behind a trunk. The forest, once peaceful, now felt watchful. Silent in a different way, not calm but holding its breath. He unclipped his radio. "Dispatch, this is Ranger Voss. I need to report an unusual situation. Location Grid Echo 7 near the old logging spur. I've found evidence of unauthorized human presence, recent and possible signs of a minor. Request immediate backup and advise county law enforcement. I'm holding position but do not approach further without support." His voice was steady, but his fingers trembled slightly as he clipped the radio back. He moved 20 yards away from the tree, finding a spot behind a thick cedar where he could observe without being seen. He sat on a fallen log, thermos forgotten, eyes fixed on the giant nest. The sun climbed higher, warming his shoulders, but he didn't feel it. His mind replayed every detail. The tarp, the footprint, the shoe. Who built that nest? Why? And where was the child now? He thought about the families who visited the reserve, mostly on weekends, sticking to the marked trails. None had reported missing persons. But maybe this wasn't a visitor. Maybe this was someone who'd been living out here for a while. Hidden, watching. Minutes stretched into an hour. Birds resumed their songs. A squirrel chattered angrily from a nearby branch. Life went on oblivious. But Elian couldn't shake the feeling that something deeply wrong had taken root in this quiet corner of the forest. He pulled out his notebook and began sketching the nest from memory. Labeling details, height, materials, position. He noted the direction of the footprints, the location of the shoe, the burn site. Every fact mattered now. As the morning wore on, a new thought crept in, one that made his stomach twist. What if whoever built that nest was still up there? What if they were watching him right now? He glanced up again, shielding his eyes from the sun. The nest looked solid, almost cozy in its construction. But nestled in the wild, it felt like an intrusion, like a secret the forest was trying to keep. Elian stayed put, waiting. The peaceful routine of his morning was gone, replaced by a quiet dread. He'd come out here to check cameras and enjoy the trees. Instead, he'd stumbled onto something that didn't make sense, and that scared him more than any bear or storm ever had. Because out here, in the deep green silence, the most dangerous things weren't always the ones with claws or fangs. Sometimes they wore boots. Sometimes they built nests. And sometimes they left behind a child's shoe as the only clue. He took a slow sip of cold coffee, eyes never leaving the tree. Whatever was happening in Cedar Hollow, it wasn't over. And Elian knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that he was now part of it, whether he wanted to be or not. Elian didn't move for a long time. He sat on the damp log, back pressed against the rough bark of the cedar behind him, eyes locked on the giant nest high in the Douglas fir. The forest had returned to its usual rhythm, birds calling, leaves rustling, but to him everything felt sharper, louder, charged with a kind of tension he couldn't name. His mind kept circling back to the shoe. Small, worn, left behind like it meant nothing. But it meant everything. He checked his watch. Almost 2 hours since he'd called it in. Dispatch had acknowledged his message, said they'd alert the county sheriff and send a ranger from the east sector as backup, but no one had arrived yet. Radio silence since then. He knew it wasn't negligence, this was remote country and help took time. But waiting made his skin itch. He forced himself to breathe slowly. Panic wouldn't help. He needed to stay sharp, observant, calm, so he turned his attention back to the ground, scanning the area with fresh eyes, looking for anything he might have missed. That's when he noticed the trail. It wasn't obvious. Not a path, not even a deer run. Just a subtle disturbance in the underbrush like someone had pushed through ferns and low branches repeatedly. He stood, brushed dirt from his pants and followed it, moving quietly, deliberately. Every few steps he stopped to look, listen, feel the air. The trail led away from the nest, curving west toward a shallow ravine he knew well. It was overgrown, rarely used, but it connected to an old creek bed that dried up in summer. As he walked, he spotted more signs. A snapped twig at waist height, too high for an animal. A patch of moss scraped clean off a rock as if someone had sat there to rest, and then near a cluster of alder saplings, another piece of trash, a crumpled energy bar wrapper, the kind sold at gas stations 50 miles away. Not biodegradable, not something a bear would carry. His stomach tightened. This wasn't random wandering. This was a route. A pattern. He followed it another 100 yards until the trees thinned slightly and the ground sloped downward. There, tucked beneath a rocky overhang half hidden by ferns, was a lean-to, crude but functional, branches propped against a fallen log, covered with more of that same faded blue tarp he'd seen woven into the nest. Inside, a rolled-up sleeping bag, a dented metal pot, and a small pile of dry firewood stacked neatly against the rock wall. Elian didn't go inside. He crouched at the edge, studying it from a distance. Whoever lived here wasn't just passing through. They'd settled in, made a home. And the nest! Maybe it wasn't a home at all. Maybe it was something else. A lookout, a storage spot, a hiding place. He backed away slowly, retracing his steps, careful not to disturb anything. When he returned to his observation spot near the big tree, he pulled out his notebook again and added new details. Location of lean-to, description of supplies, direction of trail. Then he took more photos, wide shots, close-ups, angles that showed relationships between objects. Evidence. That's what this was now. The sun was high overhead, casting sharp shadows. Sweat gathered at the base of his neck despite the cool air. He drank from his water bottle, the plastic crinkling loudly in the quiet. Too loudly. He froze, listening. Nothing, just the wind. But then, a sound. Faint, distant, a metallic clink like a pot tapping against a rock. His head snapped toward the ravine. He held his breath. Waited. Silence. Had he imagined it? Maybe, or maybe someone was down there right now. He debated his next move. Go check, stay put? His training said, do not engage. Wait for backup. But what if that person was hurt? What if they had the child? He glanced at the shoe again, still lying where he'd found it. It felt like a silent plea. Before he could decide, a voice crackled over his radio. Ranger Voss, this is Deputy Reyes. We're 10 minutes out. 2 units, K-9 team en route. Hold your position. Do not approach the site. Relief washed over him, followed quickly by tension. They were coming, good, but now the clock was ticking. If someone was still out here, they might run. Copy that, Elian replied, voice low. No movement from my end. Site appears unoccupied, but signs of recent activity are clear. He clipped the radio back and scanned the tree line one last time. Nothing moved. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. 20 minutes later, the first vehicle rumbled down the old logging road, a county sheriff's SUV, dust kicking up behind it. Two deputies stepped out, both in uniform, one leading a German shepherd on a short leash. Moments later, a second truck arrived with a woman in plain clothes, tall, sharp-eyed, with a badge clipped to her belt. Detective Lynn Tran, he'd learn later. She carried a tablet and moved with quiet confidence. Elian met them at the trailhead, keeping his voice low. "Thanks for coming fast," he said. "I've got 2 locations, the nest tree and a lean-to about a quarter-mile west. Found a child's shoe near the base of the tree. No sign of the child, but everything suggests someone's been living out here for a while." Detective Tran nodded, already taking notes. "Any idea who?" "Not yet, but the setup feels intentional. Not just camping. More like hiding." She looked up at him. "You think it's connected to a missing persons case?" "I don't know," Elian admitted. "But a kid's shoe in the middle of nowhere? That's not normal." They moved out as a group, Elian leading the way. He pointed out the trail, the snapped branches, the wrapper. The canine handler let the dog sniff the shoe, then gave a quiet command. The dog's ears perked up, tail stiff. It pulled toward the ravine. At the lean-to, the deputies secured the area while the detective photographed everything. She bagged the sleeping bag, the pot, the wrapper. Then she opened the sleeping bag slightly and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a child's drawing. Crayon on notebook paper. A stick figure girl holding hands with a taller figure under a lopsided sun. At the bottom, in wobbly letters, "Me and Daddy." Elian's throat tightened. This wasn't just evidence. It was a memory. A life. "Any names on it?" Deputy Reyes asked. "No," Tran said softly. "But this changes things." They moved back to the big tree. Now, with more eyes and better light, they saw details Elian had missed. Rope fibers embedded in the bark. Someone had climbed up. Scratches on the trunk at regular intervals, like footholds. And inside the nest, through gaps in the weave, they could see more. A plastic water bottle, a small flashlight, and what looked like pages of a notebook tucked beneath the tarp lining. Using a long pole with a camera attachment, they carefully photographed the interior without disturbing it. One image showed a page partially visible. Handwriting, dense and looping, with sketches of eyes and trees and strange symbols. "Looks like journal entries," Tran murmured. "Possibly delusional content," Elian frowned. "You think this person's unwell?" "It's possible," she said. "Living off-grid like this, building structures, leaving a child's belongings behind. It could point to mental health crisis, but we can't assume. Could also be evasion, or something darker." The K9 circled the base of the tree, then stopped, nose to the ground, and let out a low whine. The handler knelt. "He's picking up a strong human scent. Fresh, within 24 hours. A chill ran through Elian. So close. They widened their perimeter, checking every hollow, every thicket. But the forest gave up no more secrets that day. No person, no child, just traces like ghosts had passed through. Back at the command post, a folding table set up near the SUV, Tran laid out what they had. "We'll process the items tonight. Run prints, check the drawing for school logos or handwriting matches. The shoe might have DNA, and we'll cross-reference this with any open missing persons cases in the region." Elian sat on a stump, exhausted. His legs ached, his head buzzed with questions. What if the child's not? He couldn't finish the sentence. Tran looked at him, her expression unreadable. "We don't go there yet. Hope is part of the job too, Ranger." He nodded, but the weight of the shoe in his mind wouldn't lift. As dusk began to fall, they decided to leave a motion sensor camera aimed at the nest and another at the lean-to. Drones would sweep the area at first light. For now, they'd pull back, but not far. A patrol would stay overnight at the trailhead. Elian offered his cabin as a base. "It's got coffee, a radio, and a couch that's seen better days, but it's dry." Tran accepted. "Appreciate it." On the walk back, the forest felt different. Not peaceful anymore, haunted. Every shadow seemed to hold a story, every rustle a warning. Elian kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see a figure watching from the trees. At the cabin, he brewed a fresh pot while the deputies set up a comms station on his kitchen table. Tran sat by the window studying the photos on her tablet. The drawing was open on the screen, the stick figures, the crooked sun. "Her name might be Lily," she said suddenly. Elian turned. "How do you know?" "Just a hunch." The L in daddy is looped like a child who's been taught cursive early, common in certain homeschool curriculums. And there's a faint L scratched into the sole of the shoe, probably from a school tag. He hadn't noticed that. So, we're looking for a girl named Lily and her father? Or someone who called himself that, Tran said quietly. Night fell. The others took shifts. Elian tried to sleep on his cot in the back room, but his mind raced. Who was this man? Why build a nest? Why leave the shoe? Was the child safe? Hurt gone? He thought about the drawing again. Me and Daddy, it's simple, loving, not the work of someone dangerous. Or was it? Hours later, he stepped outside for air. The stars were bright, the Milky Way a silver smear across the sky. He looked toward the ridge where the nest sat hidden in darkness. Somewhere out there, a story was waiting to be told. And he had a feeling it wasn't going to end the way anyone hoped. But he also knew one thing for sure. He wouldn't stop looking. Not until they found the truth. Not until that little shoe had a foot to go back to. The forest held its breath, and Elian stood in the quiet, ready for whatever came next. By the third morning, the forest felt like a stage waiting for its next act. Elian stood at the edge of his porch, coffee in hand, watching as the first light crept over the ridge. The air was still, heavy with dew and the scent of damp earth. Inside the cabin, voices murmured. Deputy Reyes reviewing patrol routes, Detective Tran on the phone with the state lab, the canine handler checking his dog's paws after a long night on the trail. They'd been working in shifts since arriving, turning Elian's quiet home into a makeshift command post. He didn't mind. In fact, the company helped push back the unease that had settled in his chest like a stone. Overnight, the motion sensor cameras had captured nothing but raccoons and a curious fox. But at 4:17 a.m., one of the drones, flying a low sweep along the western ravine, picked up a heat signature. Small, human-sized, moving slowly through a dense thicket near a dry creek bed. No face, no clear image, just a blur of warmth in the cold green. It was enough. Now, as the sun rose, a new team assembled. 2 more deputies, a search and rescue volunteer with wilderness tracking experience, and a drone operator carrying a high-resolution thermal unit. Tran had called in extra resources after reviewing the notebook pages recovered from the nest. The handwriting was frantic, looping, filled with phrases like, "They're still watching and she's safest in the trees." One page bore a crude map of Cedar Hollow with an X marked near Blackwater Gorge, a steep, rarely visited canyon on the reserve's far edge. "They think the child might be there?" Elian asked as they loaded gear into the SUVs. "Not necessarily," Tran said, zipping her jacket. "But the person who wrote this clearly believed it was a safe zone. If he's still out there, that's where he might go." Elian nodded. He knew Blackwater Gorge well. Narrow, rocky, with sheer walls and a seasonal waterfall that turned to mist by late summer. It was easy to get trapped in, hard to escape. Not a place you'd choose unless you were desperate. Or hiding. They moved out in 2 vehicles, tires crunching on the gravel road that wound deeper into the reserve. Elian rode shotgun with Tran, who scrolled through case files on her tablet. "We ran the handwriting through the database," she said quietly. "Got a partial match." Elian turned. "To what?" "A missing persons report from 3 years ago. Corwin Hale, reported missing by his sister after he stopped answering calls. His wife and 6-year-old daughter, Lily, vanished from their home in Millfield a week before he did. No signs of struggle, no ransom note, just gone." Elian's breath caught. "Lily, the name from the drawing. Police suspected Corwin at first," Tran continued. "He had a history of anxiety, had been hospitalized briefly after his wife's brother died in a car crash. But there was no evidence, no motive. Case went cold. And now we find his daughter's shoe, and his handwriting. In a nest in the woods, exactly," she said. "Either he's been living out here this whole time, or someone's using his identity." But the emotional tone of those notes, the obsession with protection, the fear of being watched, it fits what we know about him. They fell silent as the road narrowed, trees closing in on both sides. Elian's mind raced. A grieving father lost to the world, building shelters in the trees, clinging to his daughter's memory. Or still trying to protect her? Was Lily alive? Had she been with him all along? The thought twisted in his gut. He'd seen people broken by loss, rangers who'd lost partners to avalanches, hikers who'd buried children in accidents. But this felt different. This felt like a man who'd stepped out of reality and built his own. At the trailhead to Blackwater Gorge, they parked and geared up. The drone lifted off with a soft whir, its camera scanning the canyon below. The search team split into two groups. One would follow the ridge above, the other would descend into the gorge itself. Ilian went with the ground team. His knowledge of the terrain was invaluable. The descent was steep, slick with moss in places. They moved slowly, calling out every few minutes, "Corwin, this is the sheriff's department. We're here to help." No answer came, just the echo of their voices bouncing off stone. Halfway down, the K9 stopped abruptly, ears forward, body tense. He let out a low, urgent bark and pulled toward a narrow ledge tucked beneath an overhang. The handler signaled silently. Everyone froze, Elian's heart hammered. He edged forward, peering around a boulder. There, curled against the rock wall, wrapped in a threadbare blanket, was a man. He looked like a ghost, pale, gaunt, beard tangled with leaves and dirt. His clothes hung off him like sacks, but his eyes, wide, bloodshot but clear, locked onto Elian's with startling intensity. He didn't run, didn't speak, just stared as if trying to decide whether they were real or another trick of his mind. "Corwin," Tran called gently, stepping forward with hands open, non-threatening. "My name is Detective Tran. We're not here to hurt you." The man flinched but didn't look away. His fingers clutched the blanket tighter. "She's not here," he whispered, voice raw like he hadn't used it in weeks. "I sent her away." They were getting closer. "Who's getting closer, Corwin?" Tran asked, crouching a few feet away. "The ones who took her first," he said, eyes darting to the trees above. They never stopped looking. "I saw their lights, heard their voices in the wind. I had to hide her higher up, where they can't climb." Elian exchanged a glance with Tran. Delusion, or truth wrapped in fear? "Where is she now?" Tran pressed softly. Corwin's face crumpled. "I don't know, she ran. After the storm. She said the voices scared her. I tried to follow, but my leg gave out. I've been waiting for her to come back." He lifted his left leg slightly. Beneath torn fabric, Elian saw a badly swollen ankle, discolored purple and yellow, likely broken weeks ago and never set. Tran signaled for the medic. As they approached slowly, Corwin didn't resist. He just kept murmuring, "She's smart. She knows the signals. If she sees smoke, she'll come." "What signals?" Elian asked. Corwin looked at him for the first time. 3 puffs. That's safe. 2 long, 1 short, that means danger. She knows. Elian felt a chill. This wasn't random rambling. This was a system. A language between father and child. While the medic tended to Corwin's leg, Tran searched his pack. Inside, a rusted pocket knife, a water-stained photograph of a little girl with pigtails and a gap-toothed smile, and a small velvet locket. She opened it carefully. Inside, a tiny curl of blonde hair tied with red thread. "Lily," Elian said quietly. Tran nodded, her expression unreadable. He never stopped believing she was alive. They radioed the news up to the ridge team. No sign of a child, but they'd expand the search grid immediately. Drones would scan for any shelter, any movement. Meanwhile, Corwin was carefully helped onto a stretcher. He didn't fight. He just kept whispering, "Tell her I'm sorry. Tell her I tried." Back at the cabin, Corwin sat wrapped in a clean blanket, sipping broth the deputy had heated on Elian's stove. He was quiet now, exhausted, but his eyes followed every movement, every face. Tran sat across from him, speaking gently, asking open-ended questions. "How long have you been out here?" she asked. Since they took her," he said. "I couldn't go back. They'd be watching the house. Watching me. I had to find her first, but your wife..." "She's gone," he interrupted, voice breaking. "I know that now, but Lily, she was hiding in the closet when they came. I heard her breathing. I swear I did." Then silence. "I woke up in the hospital, concussion, they said. Car accident. But I never hit anything. I was driving home from work and then... nothing. When I got back, the house was empty. No note, no call. Just her shoes by the door." Elian remembered the shoe in the moss. "One shoe, always one. Why build the nest?" he asked. Corwin looked at him confused. "It wasn't a nest. It was a watchtower. So I could see them coming. I used the tarp from our old camping gear. Lily loved that tarp. She called it our sky blanket." Tran exchanged a look with Elian. Every detail aligned, not with a criminal, but with a man unraveling under grief and guilt. Later that afternoon, the lab called. The DNA from the shoe matched Corwin's profile, maternal side consistent with a parent-child relationship. The notebook pages showed no signs of violence. No threats, just a mind fraying at the edges, trying to make sense of an unbearable loss. But then came the breakthrough no one expected. While reviewing old case files, a records clerk in Millfield noticed something. A transient logger named Daryl Boone had been questioned briefly in Lily's disappearance. He'd worked on a crew near the Hales' neighborhood the week they vanished. He had a record, assault, trespassing, and had died 2 years ago in a bar fight 3 counties over. His fingerprints, however, were on file. And when they ran them against a partial print lifted from the metal pot in the lean-to, it was a match, not Corwin's, Daryl Boone's. The room went quiet. Elian felt the pieces shift in his mind. What if Corwin hadn't taken his family? What if someone else had? And Corwin, disoriented from a possible head injury, had spent years chasing shadows, believing he was protecting his daughter when she'd been gone from the start. Tran stood abruptly. We need to exhume Boone's belongings. His truck, his storage unit, if any records exist. There might be something he kept. Something no one thought to look for. Corwin, overhearing, began to sob. Quiet, shuddering tears. All this time, I thought I failed her. But maybe she was taken before I even knew. Elian placed a hand on his shoulder. You never stopped looking. That matters. Outside, the sun dipped below the trees. The forest, once a place of mystery, now held a different kind of weight. A truth buried under years of silence. Pain and mistaken blame, and somewhere, maybe in a forgotten box in a dead man's locker, Lily's story was still waiting to be found. The days that followed felt like walking through fog. Slow, uncertain, but with glimpses of something clearer ahead. Corwin stayed at the ranger station under informal supervision, not as a suspect anymore, but as someone the system finally owed answers to. He slept in a spare bunk, ate meals with the deputies, and spent hours sitting on the porch staring into the trees as if expecting his daughter to step out from behind them. He didn't speak much, but when he did, his voice carried a quiet ache that made even the most hardened officers soften their tone. Elian kept watch from a distance, not out of suspicion, but out of a growing sense of responsibility. He'd been the one to find the shoe, the nest, the trail that led them here. Now he couldn't shake the feeling that this story wasn't just Corwin's. It was his, too. Meanwhile, Detective Tran worked tirelessly. She'd secured a court order to access Daryl Boone's old storage unit. Located in a dusty lot outside a town called Pine Ridge, Boone had died with no next of kin, and his belongings had sat untouched for 2 years, gathering dust and mildew. The unit was small, just a 10 by 10 metal box. But when the padlock was cut and the door rolled up, what they found inside changed everything. Boxes of old work clothes, a rusted chainsaw, a sleeping bag stiff with age, and beneath a pile of newspapers, a child's backpack. It was pink, faded from sun and rain, with a cartoon owl stitched on the front. Inside, a water bottle, a half-eaten granola bar wrapped in plastic, a small stuffed rabbit missing one ear, and a folded drawing, nearly identical to the one found in the lean-to. Same handwriting, same crooked sun, same words, me and Daddy, but there was more. Tucked into the side pocket was a disposable camera. The film was still inside. Tran had it developed immediately. The photos were blurry, overexposed in places, but unmistakable. A man, Daryl Boone, standing near a pickup truck. A little girl with pigtails, eyes wide with fear, holding the stuffed rabbit. Another shot. A roadside diner at night, the girl's face pressed against the window. And one final image. A hand, Boone's, holding a note that read, "She's mine now." The room went silent when Tran showed the photos to Elian and the lead investigator. No one spoke for a full minute. The truth sat heavy in the air, sharp and final. Lily hadn't run away. She hadn't hidden in the woods. She'd been taken. And Boone had kept her. For how long, no one knew. But the camera suggested he'd documented it almost proudly like a trophy. Corwin was brought in gently, seated at a clean table in the station's small briefing room. Tran didn't hand him the photos right away. She sat across from him, hands folded, and said, "We found something that belonged to Lily." His breath hitched. "Is she—" "We don't know yet," Tran said honestly. But we found proof that someone else took her. A man named Daryl Boone, he's dead now. But these are hers. She slid the backpack across the table. Corwin's hands trembled as he opened it. When he saw the stuffed rabbit, he let out a sound Elian had never heard before. Part sob, part gasp, like his heart had cracked open. He clutched the toy to his chest and wept, shoulders shaking, tears dripping onto the worn fabric. "I bought her that rabbit," he whispered. "For her 5th birthday. She called him Mr. Hops, said he kept the monsters away." Tran waited until he'd quieted before showing him the photos. He stared at them for a long time, his face pale, jaw clenched. Then he looked up, eyes burning. "He's dead?" "Yes." "Good." There was no joy in his voice, just exhaustion and a terrible kind of relief. The enemy wasn't out there in the trees. He was gone. And with him, the years of guilt Corwin had carried like a stone around his neck. But the biggest question remained: what happened to Lily? The investigation shifted again. Detectives combed through Boone's known routes, old job sites, places he'd frequented. They tracked down former co-workers, bartenders, anyone who might remember a little girl with him. One lead stood out. A waitress at a truck stop near the Idaho border recalled a rough-looking man with a quiet child about 6 years old, maybe 3 years ago. The girl barely spoke, always held that rabbit. They stayed one night, paid cash, left before dawn. Another witness, a gas station clerk, remembered Boone arguing with someone on the phone, shouting, "I didn't sign up for this," before speeding off alone. That detail hit hard. Alone. Had something happened to Lily? Had Boone abandoned her, or worse? Elian couldn't stop thinking about it. He walked the trails at night, flashlight in hand, imagining a small figure lost in the dark calling for her father. He knew the odds. 3 years was a long time. But he also knew forests held secrets for decades, bones, bottles, letters in jars. And sometimes, against all logic, people survived. One evening, as he sat with Corwin on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in gold and violet, Corwin said quietly, "I used to dream she was living with another family, happy, safe, that she forgot my face, but had a warm bed and someone who read her stories at night. I told myself that was enough." Elian didn't answer right away. "Is it?" Corwin looked at him, eyes tired but clear. "I don't know. But if she's gone, I need to know, not wonder for the rest of my life." The next morning, a breakthrough came from an unexpected place. A cold case unit in Idaho had been reviewing unsolved missing children reports and noticed a match. A Jane Doe, age estimated 6 to 8, found unconscious near a highway rest area 2 years ago. She'd been malnourished, dehydrated, and carried a stuffed rabbit missing one ear. She never spoke her name. Trauma, doctors said. She was placed in foster care under a temporary identity. Her file included a photo. Tran called Elian the moment she saw it. "It's her," she said, voice tight. "It's Lily." Elian's hands went cold. "Is she okay?" "Physically, yes. Mentally, it's complicated. She's been in therapy. Still doesn't talk much. But she responds to the name Lily, and she clings to that rabbit like it's the only thing real." They moved fast. Social services, legal clearances, DNA confirmation. It all happened in a blur. Corwin was tested immediately. The results came back in 36 hours. 99.998% match, father and daughter. But reunification wasn't simple. Trauma specialists warned against sudden contact. Lily had spent years in silence building walls. They needed to go slow. Corwin agreed to everything. He'd waited 3 years. He could wait a few more weeks. Elian watched him during that time, how he'd sit by the window, writing letters he couldn't send, folding them into paper birds. How he'd ask about her favorite color, purple, her favorite food, peanut butter sandwiches with the crust cut off, whether she still liked owls. Small things. Human things. Then came the day they arranged a supervised visit at a quiet community center in Boise. Elian drove Corwin there, though he wasn't allowed inside. He waited in the parking lot, pacing, heart in his throat. 2 hours later, Corwin emerged. His face was wet with tears, but he was smiling. A real, trembling smile. "She knew me," he said, voice cracking. "Not right away. But when I showed her the paper owl I made, she touched my hand. And she said, 'Daddy?'" Elian didn't trust himself to speak. He just nodded, clapped Corwin on the shoulder, and drove him back in silence. Over the next month, visits became more frequent. Lily began speaking in short sentences. She drew pictures of trees, of a big nest, of a man with a beard waiting under the stars. She didn't remember Boone clearly, just the loud man and the long car ride. But she remembered her father's voice, his laugh, the way he used to braid her hair. The system for once worked with mercy. Corwin wasn't rich, didn't have a fancy house, but he had love. And that, the judge said, was enough. Full custody was granted with ongoing therapy and check-ins, but no restrictions. They didn't return to the old house in Millfield. Too many ghosts. Instead, Corwin found a small cabin near a lake, 2 hours from Cedar Hollow. Quiet. Safe. Full of light. Elian visited once, a month later. He brought firewood and a potted huckleberry bush for the porch. Lily ran to him the moment he stepped out of his truck holding Mr. Hops, her pigtails bouncing. "You're the ranger," she said, grinning. "I am," he said, kneeling to her level. "And you're the bravest kid I know." She beamed. Corwin stood in the doorway, watching them, eyes bright. Later, over coffee, he said, "I used to think the forest took her from me. But really, it led you to us." Elian shook his head. "I just walked the trail. You never stopped believing." That night, as he drove back through the dark woods, Elian felt something lift from his own chest. The nest was gone now, dismantled by conservation staff, its materials archived as evidence. But its purpose, twisted as it was, had been love. A father's desperate attempt to keep his child safe in a world that had already stolen her. And in the end, love had won. Not loudly. Not perfectly. But enough. He rolled down his window, letting the cool night air fill the cab. Somewhere in the trees, an owl called. The forest breathed, and for the first time in weeks, Elian felt peace. Not because the story was over, but because it had found its way home. Winter came early to Cedar Hollow that year. Frost painted the ferns silver by dawn, and the creek near Elian's cabin ran low and quiet, its surface glazed with thin ice on the coldest mornings. The forest, once loud with birds and rustling underbrush, settled into a hushed stillness as if it, too, needed time to rest after everything that had unfolded. Elian stood on his porch one gray afternoon, hands tucked into his jacket pockets, watching snowflakes drift lazily through the trees. It had been 6 months since they'd found Corwin in the gorge, since the truth about Lily had unraveled like a tightly wound thread finally given room to breathe. Life had moved on, as it always does, but nothing felt quite the same. Not for him, not for the reserve, and certainly not for the people whose lives had been stitched back together in the most fragile, beautiful way. Corwin and Lily hadn't returned to the deep woods. They lived now in a small lakeside cabin an hour's drive east, where the neighbors knew their story but never spoke of it unless invited. Lily was in school part-time, slowly rebuilding her voice, her confidence, her sense of safety. She still carried Mr. Hops everywhere, but she also laughed now. Real, bubbling laughter that startled even her father sometimes, like a song he'd almost forgotten. Elian had visited twice since the custody hearing. The second time, Lily had shyly handed him a drawing, a tall man in a green jacket standing under a big tree, with a tiny nest high in the branches. At the bottom, in careful letters, she'd written, "Thank you for finding us." He kept it pinned above his desk. Back at the reserve, things had changed too. The incident had sparked a quiet but serious conversation among park leadership. Elian had written a proposal, simple, practical, that was now being piloted across 3 counties. A new protocol for rangers encountering unusual human-made structures in protected zones. Not just for safety, but for compassion. The guidelines included steps for documenting without disturbing, contacting mental health liaisons alongside law enforcement, and treating every sign of human presence not as a violation, but as a possible cry for help. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Today, though, Elian wasn't thinking about policy. He was thinking about the tree. He pulled on his boots, zipped his jacket, and walked the familiar trail toward the ridge. Not with urgency, but with purpose. The snow crunched softly underfoot, and his breath fogged in the cold air. When he reached the clearing where the giant nest had once hung, he stopped. The Douglas fir still stood, tall and strong, its bark rough and familiar. But the branches where the nest had been were bare now, swept clean by wind and time. The lean-to in the ravine was gone too, dismantled carefully by conservation staff. All physical traces had been removed, catalogued, stored in evidence boxes that would one day be archived or destroyed. But the memory remained. Elian walked to the base of the tree and knelt. He pulled a smooth river stone from his pocket, gray with a streak of white quartz, and placed it gently against the roots. It wasn't a memorial. Not exactly. More like a marker. A quiet acknowledgement that something real had happened here. Something painful, yes, but also something human. He sat back on his heels, looking up into the branches. He remembered the fear he'd felt that first morning, the dread coiling in his gut when he saw the child's shoe. He'd thought the worst. And in a way, he'd been right. There had been danger, loss, years of suffering. But he'd also been wrong, because the man in the trees hadn't been a threat. He'd been a father who'd lost his world and built a nest in the sky, hoping his daughter might still fly back to it. Elian smiled faintly. It sounded foolish when you said it out loud, but out here in the quiet heart of the wild it made a kind of sense. As he stood to leave, something caught his eye, a flash of color near the trunk. He crouched again. Tucked into a crevice in the bark was a small paper bird, folded from a page of a notebook. It was weathered, edges softened by rain and wind, but still intact. He recognized the handwriting on the inside flap, Corwin's looping script. For the ranger who listened. Elian's throat tightened. He hadn't known Corwin had left it. Maybe he'd come back one last time when no one was watching to say goodbye to the place where his nightmare had finally ended. He carefully unfolded the paper. On the other side was a child's drawing, Lily's unmistakably. A stick figure ranger with a big hat, standing next to a tall man and a little girl, all holding hands under a tree full of stars. At the bottom, in purple crayon, "We are safe now." Elian folded it back gently and tucked it into his breast pocket close to his heart. Then he turned and walked back down the trail, snow falling heavier now, dusting his shoulders like a blessing. That evening, back at the cabin, he brewed a pot of tea and sat by the wood stove, staring into the flames. The radio crackled softly in the background. Routine check-ins from other sectors, weather updates, a report of elk moving south. Normal sounds. Good sounds. He thought about how close they'd come to getting it all wrong. If he'd dismissed the nest as a prank. If the deputies had treated Corwin as a suspect instead of a survivor. If the cold case unit in Idaho hadn't cross-referenced that Jane Doe file. So many small choices, small acts of attention, had led to a miracle. Because that's what it felt like. A miracle with paperwork and DNA tests and therapy sessions. But a miracle all the same. A few days later, Elian received a package in the mail. No return address, just a postmark from the lake town. Inside was a small wooden owl, hand-carved, its eyes made from polished river stones. Taped to its wing was a note. "Lily made this in art class. She says every ranger needs a forest friend." C&L. He placed it on his windowsill where it caught the morning light. Life settled into a new rhythm. Elian continued his patrols, checked his cameras, wrote his reports. But now, when he saw a bent branch or an odd pile of stones, he paused longer. He looked closer. He asked himself not just who did this, but why. Because sometimes the strangest things in the wild aren't signs of danger, but signs of someone trying, desperately to stay connected to the world. One afternoon in late February, as the first hints of thaw softened the edges of the snow, Elian hiked out to the eastern meadow to check a trail camera that had gone offline. As he worked, he heard a rustle behind him. He turned, expecting a deer. Instead, he saw a young woman walking slowly along the edge of the trees. She wasn't dressed for hiking, just jeans, a thick sweater, and worn boots. But she moved with quiet confidence as if she knew the land. When she saw him, she stopped. "Ranger Voss?" she asked. He nodded, wiping his hands on his pants. "That's me." She stepped closer, holding out a thermos. "I'm Corwin's sister. I brought you coffee." He said, "You take it black." Elian blinked, then smiled. He remembered. "He remembers everything you did," she said softly. "We all do." They stood in the meadow for a while, sipping coffee as the sun broke through the clouds. She told him how Lily was doing, how she'd started riding a bike, how she'd made a friend at school, how she still asked about the big tree with the sky blanket. She told him Corwin was working part-time at a local nursery, learning about native plants, trying to grow things instead of just surviving. "He says the forest didn't steal her," she said, looking out over the trees. He says it held her story until someone was ready to hear it. Elian didn't answer right away. He just watched a hawk circle high above, riding the wind with effortless grace. Maybe that was the real lesson, he thought. Not that the wild is dangerous, but that it's patient. It keeps secrets, yes, but it also keeps hope. Sometimes it takes a ranger walking a quiet trail. Sometimes it takes a broken man building a nest in the sky. And sometimes it takes a little girl who never stopped believing her daddy would find her. As the woman left, she turned and said, "He wants you to come for Lily's birthday next month. She's turning 9. She's making a cake shaped like a nest." Elian laughed, a real warm sound that startled even him. "I'd be honored." That night he sat on his porch again, wrapped in a blanket, watching the stars come out one by one. The forest was silent but not empty. It was full of stories. Old ones, new ones still being written. And for the first time in a long time, Elian felt like he wasn't just protecting the land. He was part of its heartbeat. He reached into his pocket and touched the folded drawing, still there, still safe. Then he looked up at the sky where the Milky Way stretched like a promise across the dark. Somewhere out there, a little girl was sleeping peacefully, her stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm. Her father was nearby, watching over her, finally at peace. And here in the quiet woods, a ranger sat under the stars, knowing that sometimes the most important things you find in the forest aren't things at all, but people. And that was enough. More than enough. The snow had melted from the trail by morning. Spring was coming. And with it, new stories, new chances, new nests waiting to be built. Not in the trees, but in the hearts of those who dared to hope, even when the world went dark.